Let me paint a picture for you and see if this is something that is a familiar one in your world. You've been asked to prepare a presentation on a topic for some senior leaders, and you go through the whole process of putting together what you consider to be a really detailed presentation that is going to answer all the questions that they will likely have, and you have practiced it, you're ready to deliver it, and you get into the room, you get into that meeting, and suddenly you get to slide 2 and you are stopped. They won't let you get past slide 2 because they want to interrupt you by asking questions that have no relevance to what you're presenting, or they start talking amongst themselves, or they start taking you down rabbit holes, or they ask you a question that you had intended to answer, but like 10 slides later. So what do? In that case, do you just give up and allow them to hijack your presentation? Well, today is all about giving you some alternatives to that. In fact, I'm going to give you 5 ways you can control the conversation, even if you are the least senior person in the room. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a 4-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. So controlling the conversation is one of my favorite topics because I'm so often asked about how to manage this very common situation. And I think it's important that we just from the get-go address the power dynamic in the room. So their titles of the people who you're talking to might be much more impressive than your own. But understand that even though they might be higher on the corporate ladder or on the corporate food chain, still, you've got a job to do. Your job is something they asked you to do. They're asking you to present information that they likely need in order to make a better business decision. So you've got a mission. And even though it might be intimidating to push back on those interruptions or to push back on some of the rabbit holes that they want to take you down, you have to consider what you are there to do. And my word to you above all else is don't give up on that mission, because what you are there to do is important. It's important for the business as a whole. And sometimes they might be their own worst enemies because they become sidetracked. So your job is to do your best to keep them on track. But let's also talk a little bit about what is a very common thing that I hear often is people think there might be some nefarious reason why senior leaders might interrupt you. They think, oh, they're just trying to make me look bad, or they're just trying to, throw me off on purpose. I would say most of the time that's not the case. The majority of the time, what's happening is it's a reflection on the part of the senior leader who is interested in what you have to say, and they're trying to learn more faster. So consider their perspective. Often, the higher up you go in the corporate food chain, the more decisions that you have to make and the more consequential those decisions are. And there's not a whole lot of time to sit and weigh the options. And so oftentimes those questions that seem really annoying to us because we have a story that we want to tell in our own way is simply a reflection of them trying to take a shortcut to the answers that they are trying to get. Because, just consider this, they have a better sense of the overall corporate vision. They have a much wider view of the big picture, and they're trying to figure out how your information, fits in to that bigger picture. So those questions might not be full of ill intent. It might be a matter of them just having buy-in, but they want to know more, and they want to know more faster so that they can get to the answers that they need. So it's really critical when you go into these situations to try to separate intent from impact. So try to do that, because that'll help you to become less frustrated perhaps and aggravated when those interruptions inevitably happen, because that's just part and parcel of presenting up. All right. So those are the caveats, I would say. But let's actually talk a little bit about the strategies that I mentioned. I'm going to present 5 different things that you can do in order to better increase your chances of actually getting through your content, or at least the critical parts of your content. This is the most common complaint that I hear from people who are in a position where they're trying to present their information up. So let's begin with what happens before you actually begin your presentation. And so the first strategy is setting expectations. So what do I mean by setting expectations? Before you begin your official presentation, I would suggest that you actually let them know how you plan to use your presentation time. So maybe you say, if it's okay with you, I'd like to first summarize the information for you for the first couple of minutes, and then I'm going to leave the remainder of our time for discussion. So that at that point will at least give them a heads up how you plan to actually deliver the information to them and how you're hoping to get their responses to it, their feedback to it. And that can at least, get you some initial buy-in. If you put it out there and say, hey, is that okay with you? And they're like, yeah, that sounds fine. At least you have tacit approval for your plan. And at least it should hold off even the most impatient of executive and keep them from interrupting you, as soon as you open your mouth. So a quick side note on this, though. Sometimes I see people try to take their entire presentation time slot. So say, on the agenda, they'll say, okay, you've got 20 minutes to present. Don't try to use that entire time for presenting your own content. So what you want to follow is the 50-50 rule, which means use half of that time for you presenting your information and then half of the time for Q&A. So as you're planning what to include and what not to include, don't have 20 minutes worth of presentation content that you are preparing to deliver because you're probably not going to get through it. In fact, if you get through half of it, sometimes that's a win. But if you set yourself up so that, okay, I'm going to try to present this much information, then open it up to the floor for questions, then you're going to be in pretty good shape. So with that in mind, though, let's go to the suggestion number 2, strategy number 2, which is be realistic in what you can fit in and what you can't. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see often made is people will try to take 10 pounds of information and put it into a 5-pound bag. That is not going to work very well. Sometimes people just try to pick up the pace and they're speaking in order to fit more in, but that also is ineffective, as you know, because all that information just goes in one ear and out the other, nothing sticks. So be realistic with how much time you have in the agenda and how much you can fit in to that time slot. And with that in mind, give them what they need, not everything you've got. It's hard to do that, especially if you're a subject matter expert and you just want to share all that you know. But oftentimes when you're a subject matter expert, there is already an understanding that you know what you're talking about. So you don't have to prove your credibility in this space. They know that you're credible. They're asking you to present the information because they know that you know more about them or know more about what you were saying than they do. And they're asking you to educate them. But you can't share everything in your brain with them because, frankly, you don't have time. They're not going to give you the time either. So when you are presenting up, what I would suggest is that you want to look to connect the dots. So help them understand what is most relevant for them in the information that you are presenting. You don't want to share all the dots and then just leave it to them to figure out, what is important and what is not. You don't want to have them, perhaps try to figure out their own conclusions. You want to at least give them a sense of this is what this means. And then you can open it up for discussion. But if you just present straight up fact without it interpreting it at all, it can be really problematic. So do remember that they can ask plenty of follow-up questions. It doesn't have to be just you telling them everything all at once and blowing through all your content. Sometimes we try to preempt the questions that we think they're going to ask. And we include as much as we possibly can in order to keep them from asking the question. But consider this, we may not know what is most important to them. We might spend a whole lot of time addressing a topic that, frankly, they really don't care about that much. And find out when we get into the room that they actually care about this other topic that you really hadn't given all that much time to. Then you've wasted their time focusing on something that is not interesting to them and shorten the time on something that they are interested in. So consider how you want to run that initial part of the presentation. Give them the basic information, and then allow them to ask those follow-up questions, which you know they will ask anyway. Which brings me to the third strategy, which is don't bury the lead. Okay, that is maybe an unfamiliar term to you. It's something that I learned early on in my journalism career. I was working for a biweekly newspaper, and I had an editor who would always say to me, Karin, don't bury the lead. And I found out what that meant very quickly. So when I worked in print, we had inches that we were allotted for a story. And if you think about like a column in a newspaper, for example, your column, you have so many inches that you can fill. So what would happen sometimes is there would be other stories that would come in and they'd have to shorten other people's stories. So your 10 inches suddenly became like 5 inches and like the second half of your story was cut off. So imagine if the most important information was in paragraph number 7 rather than paragraph number 1. The most important information might be left off the page. So when I say don't bury your lead when you're presenting up, that means I want you to put your most important information at the beginning, because what that does is it allows you to ensure that they hear what you want them to hear before they can cut you off. So what this is alluding to is a difference in communication preference and communication style that falls under the category of inductive and deductive communication. So I'm getting a little bit in the weeds on this, but it's worth noting. So all of us typically have a default that we prefer. So inductive communication is where you weave a tale, you build a case, and then you have the big reveal at the end. And this is why. Deductive communicators are those who give you the point first, they bottom line you, and then they provide the supporting details afterwards. So if you are a great storyteller, in all likelihood, you're somebody who enjoys inductive communication. But if you are going into a room with senior leaders, that can work against you because oftentimes those senior leaders are not going to want to wait for the big reveal. So in order to have them hear what they need to hear, you got to put your most important information first. You want to put your lead first so that they can actually, receive the information and hear it. But there's another thing that was really interesting that I heard from another senior leader who I was working with. And I was just asking them about how they prefer people to present to them. And they actually said, no, definitely, please lead with the call to action at the beginning. Let me know what you're asking for. And I said, well, why? Why is that important to you? And they said, because it makes me listen differently. So if you tell them what you're asking for right at the beginning, then they're going to tune their ears to listen for the information that will either make them say yes or say no to your request. But what is really annoying to many of them is if you don't let them know what you're asking for until the end. In fact, this leader said it's really frustrating when we get to the end of a presentation and they say, yeah, and this is why we're asking for an initial investment of $1 million. And I would have listened differently if I knew that they were asking for $1 million, but they didn't give me the chance. I almost wanted them to rewind and go back to the beginning. So do yourself a favor, be brave and actually put the call to action at the beginning, put the most important information at the beginning, put the ask at the beginning, because then you're not wasting their time. All right, so strategy number 4, we're going through these pretty quickly, is don't immediately hand over the speaking baton. So just because you're asked a question by a senior leader doesn't mean that you need to completely change your talk track. What I like to think about a question as is more of a speed bump rather than something that dictates you take a complete left turn. Think about how you can satisfy the curiosity of that particular leader, but not completely throw you off so that you're not getting through any of the message that is important for them to hear, oftentimes that they have asked you to deliver. So here are a couple of things that you can do when somebody asks you a question. You can try one of three options. So if you are asked a question on something that you plan to speak to later, what I have tried and what you may try is let them know that you plan to address it a little bit later in the presentation. And you can, ask if that's okay, if we wait until then, because I want to make sure I can finish my thought here. So it'll set up a discussion on the topic that you're requesting. And oftentimes, if you just let them know, hey, I am going to talk about this, then that's enough to hold them off. They just wanted to make sure that it was going to be addressed. It came to them in the moment. And as soon as you acknowledge that, yes, this is important to me as well, it's why I'm including it in about 5 minutes, then you can move on. The second thing that you can try, especially if they ask you a question that you aren't planning on speaking to in the presentation itself, is you can actually say something along the lines of, that is a really interesting thought that you're just bringing forward, an interesting question that you're bringing forward. And I think it's worth a larger discussion than what time allows here. So would it be okay if we had a follow-up meeting to discuss this and we can go more in depth, because I really think it deserves a longer airing. And typically that will work pretty well, especially if it's something that is only of interest to like one person in the room and you've got like 5 people you're presenting to. So you can ask for a meeting afterwards to have a deeper discussion. The third thing that you can try is if somebody asks you a question and it would be unwise not to answer the question in the moment, because perhaps it's a personality thing. Perhaps they are at such a high level. If you didn't address it, it would really annoy them and you don't want to be in that situation. In that case, I would say definitely answer it, but don't feel like you need to go really deep. I would say try to answer it succinctly, but fully. And then look for ways to transition back to the topic that you were discussing before the question was asked. It's really important to always think about where you are in the story that you're trying to tell so that you can get back to where you were, get back to that place in your story and you can finish it in full. So I like to think about it as a speaking baton. So when I am speaking, like right now, I'm holding the speaking baton. If somebody asks me a question, what I will often do is I'll kind of pass it to them, but not let go. And we'll jointly hold the speaking baton as they're asking the question. And then at that moment, I have to decide whether, okay, I'm going to let you take the baton from me and let you talk for a while, or I'm going to hold on to it with you. And I'm going to address your question briefly. And then I'm going to very deftly take it back and continue on with my race. So it's something that takes some practice, because I think there's a real natural desire to just hand it over to them, especially if they are somebody who is at a lofty level. It's scary to think about trying to still exert control in that situation. But always remember, it's important for you to do so because they need to make a good business decision based upon your information. And if you don't have an opportunity to deliver all that information, they might make a decision that is not going to be good because they don't have the full picture of what's going on. So hold on to that speaking baton, maybe hold on to it with them, but don't completely give it over to them unless it's absolutely positively necessary. All right. So the fifth strategy I would say to test out is being flexible. Be flexible in both your verbal as well as visual. So you need to be flexible in how you speak to your topic, but also be flexible in the slides that you use to accompany your oratory. So, as we know, presenting up rarely goes as planned. You might have done a lot of practice leading up to it. Maybe you've talked through it several times, but then they have something else in their minds when you go into the room and they want to ask about something else. And then it feels like a mess. It feels like it's not what you had planned. So what can you do to be able to pivot Well, if you're using slides, it's really important that you think about how you are designing your deck so that it is flexible as well. So one of the best practices that I always advise is at the beginning of your deck, you want to have a slide that contains your key takeaways. So I call it a core message slide. And the core message slide might include at the top, like your ask, your CTA, your call to action, or your most important information at the top. And then maybe you have like 3 supporting points for it. So if I were to put it into like the context of healthful eating habits, like, so say at the top, I would say, in the title, healthful eating habits lead to a longer life. Okay. So that would be like the most important information. And then I might have, 3 bullets underneath. The first would be, eat a big breakfast, or that's probably not true, but eat a healthy breakfast. The lunch bullet, which would be the second one, would be make sure you don't skip lunch. And then the third bullet would be make sure that you eat dinner several hours before you go to bed. I don't know if these have basis in fact, but I'm just giving you an example. But it's going to have pretty minimal information on there. But you're going to probably address all 3 of those points in a much longer version of your presentation, but you're laying out the framework for what they're about to hear. So if you have that as like your second slide, say that you get into the presentation, you hit that slide, you have a choice. You can use that as almost like an agenda slide. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to explain to you why healthful eating habits are so important for longevity. And then you'd say, and I'm going to talk about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then you go into talking about breakfast and talking about lunch and then talking about dinner. But there might be a situation where you do have that really eager executive who immediately starts talking to you and asking questions about lunch. Well, okay, you've got that slide up there. So you're visually supporting what you were saying on the screen. And you can actually talk through your entire presentation just using that one slide. So that core message slide, that initial like kind of summary slide, it's going to contain your key takeaways at a very high level. You can use it as an agenda or you can use it as your only slide, but it's almost like a safety net just in case they won't let you click beyond slide 2. The other thing I like to do to keep my deck as flexible as possible is making sure that I front load my deck with slides that are less text heavy. So you might have a 100 slide deck, but you're not going to be able to present 100 slides. Maybe you present like the first 5 or 6. Those first 5 or 6 are probably not going to have a lot of text on them. They'll have, the important key takeaways, but they're not going to be super duper detailed because that will allow you to be the main source of information in that room. You don't want your slide to be the be all end all. You want to have you be the messenger, but you use the slide to support what you're saying. So if you front load your deck with these less text heavy slides, they're easier to speak to, but you have to be ready to jump to slides that offer the details, because you might have that senior executive who you can't say no to, who says, hey, but I want to see the information that supports that key takeaway that you're saying there. You need to have some way to jump to that quickly. So here are the things that I've seen people do that have worked pretty well. The first is to like embed a hyperlink from the general slide to the more detailed slide. So say, for example, using my breakfast, lunch, dinner example. So for the breakfast, maybe you have a hyperlink to the nutritional value of eggs that you can jump to. Or what you can do is you can actually drag, if you're in PowerPoint, drag a thumbnail of that slide and put it, in the lower left-hand corner, lower right-hand corner, whatever it is, that will allow you to click on that and go immediately to that slide. And then you can use the back button to get back to your original place. What I've also seen work really well, and something that I actually do, is I'll keep an index of my slides by topic. With a number beside them, and say that somebody asks me a question about public speaking anxiety. I can quickly glance at my list of slides, and I'll have that written like public speaking anxiety 1, and say that the slide number is 34. I can just put 3, 4 return on my laptop and it'll take me to that slide. So it allows me to jump around and not have to go click, 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 and try to get to the proper slide. So, if you have a deck that will flex with you, it can make you feel more in control when you get into that room, not just verbally, but visually as well. So here's the big takeaway for this particular episode. You might be the least senior person in the room, but guess what? You still can exert some control in that room. But you have to be intentional. You have to be respectful, of course, during the actual meeting, but you have to be intentional so that you can do your job. Your job is to present information they need. And even though that you might feel like they're working against you, you know that you need to keep them on track and make sure that you can provide what they are requesting of you so that they can do their job better. All right, so I gave you a lot of strategies that perhaps you remember half of them, perhaps you remember none of them. So that's why this week's bonus content is good news, because if you go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content, there you will find a cheat sheet for controlling the conversation. So on that, you'll see some of the strategies I shared with you today, but also a couple of others that you might want to try. And the quick caveat for all of this is, not all strategies work with all personalities, but at least you have a number of tools in your toolbox that you can try and employ. The Speaker Dynamics Own the Room community continues to grow, and I am forever grateful for that. If you have not done so, please give us a like, subscribe, tell your friends, your family, your colleagues that we are out there so that we can help cut through the noise and people can find us and perhaps learn more about controlling the conversation like you did today. I do want to thank you for listening to this particular episode. Until next time.